On this day, the 13th of November, 1775, Montreal falls to American rebel forces led by Richard Montgomery. It seems that for quite a while, the Americans have always had this thing about Canada. They always wanted to take it, invade it, incorporate it, and make it their own. And it seems that every time they tried, Canadians wouldn't have anything to do with it. Both in 1775 and throughout the American Revolution, and later on, the War of 1812, and even later, during the American Civil War, when they confederated to form the new Dominion. Throughout their early history, at least, and right up until the 20th century, Canadians always were suspicious of the Americans, and there were many Americans who always wanted Canada to become a part of the United States. And this was no different in 1775, a year after the American Revolution had broken out. At this point, British forces were withdrawing from New England, Virginia, and other American states. In many ways, the first phase of the war happened quite quickly. American forces took over very quickly. The British forces were small, unprepared, and they eventually withdrew. It was only later on they came back in greater force, with more ships and more men, when the second phase of the war began, which was the most bloody and violent, and in which Britain reoccupied much of what is now the eastern seaboard of the United States. So in 1775, they'd been doing quite well, the Americans, and their newly established Continental Army was sent into Quebec, or into Canada as they called it then, to take the main cities and push the British out of North America altogether. They thought they could get French Canadians, or the Canadians, I suppose at the time there weren't many English Canadians. They thought they would get the Canadians to revolt against the British. And it made sense in many ways. They were French, don't really have that much love for the British, historically anyway. But since the British conquest in 1860, the governors and rulers in Quebec had actually been quite decent rulers. Catholicism was allowed, free worship, the first part of the British Empire in which Catholicism wasn't illegal. They allowed them to keep their legal system, so they still had their little petty lords in control of the land along the St. Lawrence River, and they were allowed to speak French, so they had quite a good deal. And there was no more wars anymore, because most of the time for the previous 100 years there'd been almost unceasing conflict between the French province of Quebec, New France, and between New England and New York. So now there was peace, or had been peace. They'd had 20 odd years, peace, prosperity, and decent rule. So the Americans came in expecting that they might jump at the chance, and a few Canadians did join the American Continental Army. But the reception when they marched into Quebec wasn't what they probably expected. The people of Quebec were not enthusiastic about this at all, and most of the time they resisted and fought with the British against the Americans. It seems that they didn't want really anything to do with them, and for good reason. For they were ancient enemies now, the English-speaking Americans and the French-speaking Canadians. Just as in the Old World, where the English and the French are enemies, so in the New World they were enemies. They had been fighting each other on and off for a very long time. And they were Protestant. And many of them were Protestant bigots against Catholicism and Catholics in general. One of the acts, the intolerable acts the Americans accused Britain of, was being so decent towards the Quebec people. So this didn't sound very good to the Quebecers. So there was very little welcome, or very little warmth when the Americans came marching in. So the plan was that Richard Montgomery would march into Quebec from Lake Champlain. He would take towns and forts on the way to Montreal, take Montreal, and then march down to Quebec, where he would meet Benedict Arnold, the famous turncoat, who was marching from New England through Maine towards Quebec. They would meet at Quebec and take Quebec, and once they'd done that, the Brits would be out almost completely. They would only have Halifax and Newfoundland at that point. So, first of all, Richard Montgomery came in through Lake Champlain, marched down towards St. John's, or the French Saint-Jean, on the Richelieu River, which is quite near to Quebec. There they fought with Guy Carleton's forces. So Guy Carleton was the British general in Montreal. He asked for assistance from Quebec, which was the main British centre at the time. Didn't get much help, and so he decided the best course was to withdraw back to Quebec City, where they could put up a good fight. So on the 13th of November 1775, Richard Montgomery's forces marched into Quebec without much of a fight, and Guy Carleton just about made it out before the Americans arrived. Later on, they marched down to Quebec as was planned, but the Americans, when they were occupying Montreal, apparently weren't the best at organizing things or ruling. They're very unpopular with the locals, caused a lot of resentment. And at Quebec City, one of the first instances of biological warfare. The forces in Quebec sent out people with smallpox and prostitutes with syphilis into the ranks of the American troops, felling many thousands. So that campaign didn't go very well at all. The Americans had to withdraw in December, in the middle of the Canadian winter. Not a good time to be marching in the snow, especially if you have syphilis and smallpox. So it was a bit of a disaster, and their rule in Montreal and their marching around hadn't made them any friends in the St. Lawrence Valley. The Americans never seriously tried to invade or occupy Quebec after this, during the American Civil War. So, on this day, 13th of November 1775, Guy Carleton makes a quick exit from Montreal, and Richard Montgomery occupies it. If you like these videos, come back for more tomorrow. Like, subscribe, and comment.